Hey Steve, welcome back.
Glad to be here. Good seeing you again.
You need one of those multi-time visitor jackets. Like I've done the show 5 times.
Yeah. Am I joining the event club here?
5 event club, yeah, like on Saturday Night Live. Hey, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about today about vulnerability and exposure management. Of course, you run security for a very well-known financial services company, and if you want to mention them, you certainly can. You're well-known in the industry, so I think you've got some great perspectives on it. But my first bit here is, why do organizations like yours really need to think beyond traditional vulnerability management? I mean, people have been scanning for vulnerabilities for years, but why is the whole notion of exposure management a critical piece of that?
Well, when you start hearing exposure, the first thing you think about is external only, and that's really just a small part of the big picture. You want to check your exposure on all your assets. So visibility is really kind of critical in that aspect. How do you ensure that you're scanning everything? And that's the really one of the tough pieces is ensuring that you're fully covering all of your assets. So for us, we want to make sure that we are taking into consideration all vulnerabilities across the spectrum. It's not just, you know, did you install the latest Windows patch for this month on Patch Tuesday? That's While it's important, that's not the big picture here that we're trying to take a look at. It's all vulnerabilities and weaknesses and configuration gaps that we're interested in. So that's where I think of exposure when you talk about exposure.
Yeah, yeah, and you're absolutely right. I think a lot of people do sometimes think of it from, depending on what your role is, outside in or inside out, but the two have to go together. Do you find that, knowing a system has a vulnerability, of course, you want to know that. You want to know what CVEs, are they critical, high, medium, low, that sort of thing. And it's important because then you look at that combination with, is there sensitive data on it? Is this tied to, customer information, supply chain? Do executives use this? Whatever, but also simply, do I have my EDR installed on this? Do I have my patch management? I mean, real nuts and bolts stuff. How are you addressing that today?
Well, what you really described was probably the core. Well, I started in this industry before there was any sort of scoring. There was the CERT advisory that came out way back in the day. I had a CERT advisory come out because of my work in 1996. But CVSS came out in the 2005 timeframe, where you could kind of get a risk that the vulnerability exists and there's a severity between 0 and 10, with 10 being the most secure or most severe. We've actually expanded from that 2005 CVSS into something much more detailed to include, are there active threats? Are there active exploits being undertaken by threat actors? Um, what's the likelihood that that software vulnerability will be exploited in the wild?
Yeah.
Those are all key pieces in evaluating the real risk of that vulnerability. And a CVE is not the only place that you can have, a gap or a weakness. The CWEs count, the your CIS benchmarks on your assets also count in making sure that your basic hygiene is in place. In addition to patching, there's also the configuration items.
Yeah.
And then really, one of the things that we don't get enough credit for in the industry is all of the money we've spent on security tools. Everybody has now an EDR in place. Hopefully, there are intrusion detection systems and firewalls and secure web gateways and all of these different tools that hopefully prevent vulnerabilities from being exploited while they're not yet being patched.
Yeah.
And for me, that's really that next level of risk determination is taking all of those security tools you have in place in your environment today, the EDR in your system, and all of the patches that you have or have not applied to develop that real applicable risk in all of these different gaps. That then you can share with the proper remediation teams to focus their next level of effort on addressing the highest risk items.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned a couple things there I wanted to double click on. The first one was just because something's a 10, right, doesn't mean it's the first thing that you need to look at, right? There's a lot of other
Right.
things to consider, like, hey, it's a 10, but there's a compensating control on it. It's a 10, but it's not a critical asset, so on and so forth. And that can get pretty detailed. One of the things that I like is Sevco. We integrated with Bull and Check probably, I want to say about a year ago now, at least 3 quarters ago, but probably a year ago. And there's this one capability where it says, here's the CVE, and by the way, there's 13 known exploits for this CVE, and it's not just a white paper. You can get the Python script, you can get the Metasploit plugin, you can buy it on the dark web, and here's an article about two APTs that happen to be leveraging this, and it really gives you rich
Yeah.
context, right? If you want it. And are you going to do that for everything? No way. But the real critical stuff, you probably will. The other thing you mentioned is you were mentioning CVEs and you have all these tools and EDRs. Let me ask you, it used to be you got CVEs from scanners, right? You'd scan a bunch of stuff, you'd get a bunch of vulnerabilities associated with IP addresses, and you just go for it. But today you're getting it from Automox, you're getting it from CrowdStrike, you're getting it from
Microsoft
Microsoft
Defender.
Defender, so many CVEs, right?
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
almost like, okay, now I have to wrestle all this. Are you leveraging multiple sources of CVEs today when you do your analysis?
So the answer is we do both, and let me explain why.
Okay.
Um, so our statement of record, of course, is one vulnerability scanning tool that we use in our day-to-day environment that we use to report up to the board what our vulnerability stance is.
Yeah.
That's the statement of record. On the other hand, we have other tools that provide additional context and additional information that we address higher risk items or things that aren't found in the statement of record vulnerability scanner. So the answer is yes, on both cases.
Okay.
Yes, we have one tool that we report up with, and yes, we employ multiple tools
Multiples.
to reduce the risk in the entire environment.
Yeah. Fair enough. Fair enough. And last question, just sort of stories from the trenches. And I know that I'm really excited to ask you this because I know your environment is very cloud heavy, right? You have a hybrid environment like most, but I think you would say it leans heavily to the cloud. So your experience when it comes to actual damage that's inflicted in terms of a potential breach or the amount of time it takes to address a situation or the number of disparate groups that you have to get involved in something, what's causing the biggest issue from the lens of looking at exposure and vulnerability management? And what I mean by that, I know this is kind of a weird way to phrase this question, but is it like my end of life systems, they're causing the most pain, or is it misconfigured systems, or controls aren't being updated in time? What's kind of giving you the most ugh factor?
Okay, so there's a couple ways to address that. The first is how well are you doing in terms of zero trust implementation
Hmm.
in your journey on zero trust? If you're really well done on the network side, then your lateral movement piece is much smaller, hopefully, to limit the blast radius on any sort of attack or system breach. So I feel comfortable there. We're you mentioned hybrid, but we're really 100% in the cloud. Our infrastructure is in Amazon, and we have a ton of SaaS apps. So
I was
we
kind of
don't
being
have
nice when I was saying hybrid. There's some server back in the closet somewhere that we don't like
nope.
to talk about it.
Not even that.
Yeah,
We have on-prem Surface hubs or something like that.
sure.
But yeah, they have vulnerabilities and exposures.
Yeah.
And pen testers like to go after those when they're on site. But really, from our perspective, zero trust segmentation is that first step in making sure that you limit the exposure. From our perspective, I think it's more back to how well managed and secure through configuration management tools and posture management tools is our cloud environment. So from that perspective, we have tools that sit on top of our cloud environment. AWS, we're using a CSPM on top of that. We did that very early and helped us convince our regulators that we weren't going in blind, open, and the Capital One breach was not going to happen to us.
Yeah.
Um, since then, we've gone into all sorts of SaaS applications like Snowflake and Salesforce and Adobe Experience Manager, and we have tools to sit on top of them to make sure that our configurations are secure. The problem that you have there, they're not infrastructure, so that familiar CIS benchmark for all these long time infrastructure components, Windows, Unix, Cisco gear, that doesn't exist. So the next best for us is to take vendor best practices, implement those in a SSPM, SaaS software security posture management tool, and then make sure that your configurations aren't stupid on top of that. So
So,
you heard Snowflake was blamed, but it was really the customers of Snowflake that didn't have MFA turned on and didn't have IP address restrictions, lost their data. Um, so those types of tools sit on top of our cloud SaaS applications to make sure that we're doing the right things. So limiting your exposure through those types of tools for us is really helpful.
awesome. Awesome. Well, Steve, as always, thanks for sharing your wisdom. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, enjoyed it.